The University of Santo Tomas in the heart of Manila, Philippines, is one of the top private comprehensive universities in the country and is Asia's only pontifical institution. UST, the Catholic University of the Philippines, enjoys local and international repute. With over 4 centuries of experience in delivering quality Catholic education, adapting to the times and surmounting obstacles are not new to UST, and the worst crisis of our time is no exception.
Abot 170 katao ang binabantayan ng Department of Health.
The Health Department has raised Code Red Sub-Level 1 alert over the coronavirus disease or COVID-19.
Not one to be overpowered by storms and headwinds, the University of Santo Tomas faced the challenge of flexible and responsive management head-on, with the enriched virtual mode of instruction powered by the UST Cloud Campus. Building on 18 years of experience in massive-wide e-learning adoption, the enriched virtual mode of instruction was adopted in response to the quick shift to fully online instruction. Since March 9, 2020, the EVM has helped ensure the continuity of quality Catholic education to over 40,000 plus students during our generation's most perilous period. Our pandemic story is one of vigilance, cooperation, care, and grace. Even before the lockdown, we addressed one important question. What happens when the campus closes? The answer was found in the university's institutional continuity plan for teaching and learning, which highlighted the use of a vital resource, the UST Cloud Campus. What was hoped to be a temporary disruption, however, morphed into the new normal, which we now navigate with the guidance from the principles of dialogue, accessibility, and flexibility in learning. The EVM harnesses the shared desire of staff and students to succeed, the technological resources available, and the innate abilities and talents of all. All courses, including laboratory, skills-based, and internship courses, fully transition to online means with provisions for offline means as needed, showcasing the mettle of faculty experts who devised alternative means to impart knowledge, skills, and values from a distance. Complementing the expertise of the Mashan academic staff who work collaboratively to teach learners were the enrichments to instruction in the form of remote encounters with community partners, collaborative learning opportunities with foreign partner institutions, and interactions with industry partners and alumni. Collectively, these interventions led to a common goal, the formation of the Mashans, who embody our core values and are stamped with the seal of the Mashan education. The uncertainties caused by lockdowns that seemingly had no end in sight beg the question, can we do this? As the past year has shown, we can, we have. The period of transition was a testament to the ability of stakeholders to rise above the situation and continue teaching and learning within the resources available. The question of what now was answered through the cooperation of all. A pre-existing university-wide faculty training initiative, a university mandate to utilize blended learning even before the pandemic, the near 2-decade e-learning expertise of the Educational Technology Center, the establishment of the Center for Innovative Teaching and Educational Delivery, and the availability of digital learning tools and resources, to name a few, were UST's buttress against the question on resources. These resources found their way out of España, reaching Thomasians all over the country and abroad. A university-level committee, the Task Force Veritas, conducted a university-wide assessment of the readiness to shift to virtual operations, helping harmonize the efforts of all academic and support units. The Office of the Vice Rector for Academic Affairs, together with the heads of the university's 22 degree-granting academic units, led the swift transition to remote teaching and learning through collaborative policy and program development, implementation, evaluation, and continuous improvement. Giving life to the support system to address educational needs are the Educational Technology Center, the country's pioneer in massive e-learning adoption, and the Miguel de Benavides Library, whose core of specialists and support personnel collectively ensure the delivery of academic or technical support services to faculty and students. Vital technological infrastructure were upgraded to meet the demands of running a university beyond the four walls of the campus. This led to the transition of full virtual delivery of services, attending to stakeholders' health, wellness, and spiritual needs. Care is the driving force behind the EVM's continued enhancement, made possible through the intensification of existing communication channels with students at the university, academic unit, program, and classroom levels. Through continued dialogue with students and staff, UST has been able to make data-driven decisions on how to move forward in balancing the concerns of quality education and wellness. Instructional delivery factors in the technological capacity and internet connectivity of learners provided a framework to classify strategies and materials. Regular review and adjustment of course plans prioritize learning outcomes and content, resulting in realistic educational delivery that factors in the achievement of outcomes and management of workload. More than a year since EVM began, the university has proven that with the right blend of people, principles, process, and product, even the gargantuan task of shifting over 43,000 people to a new mode of educational delivery is possible. Tested through the stringent external review by international and local agencies, the EVM has shown its viability and success to continue delivering the Thomasian brand of education. This brand of education is what our pandemic classes bring with them into the world outside Sampaloc. A brand of education that is competent, compassionate, and committed. A brand of education given to the children of unending grace.
morning to our viewers and to our 300 participants who have registered for this webinar. Welcome to the 12th webinar of the UST Department of History. I am Glendale John Sigo, faculty member from the UST Department of History, and will serve as your Master of Ceremonies for this event. Before anything else, let us have first the invocation led by Father Gerard Francisco P. Timoner III, Master of the Order of Preachers, to be followed by the Philippine National Anthem.
Dear brothers and sisters, I invite you to pray with me the 13th century Dominican blessing. Let us all be aware of God's abiding presence in our midst. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. May God the Father bless us. May God the Son heal us. May God the Holy Spirit enlighten us and give us eyes to see with, ears to hear with, hands to do the work of God with, feet to walk with, and mouth to preach the word of salvation with. And may the angel of peace to watch over us and lead us at last by our Lord's gift to the kingdom. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
At this point, to formally open our webinar this morning, let me call on the chairperson of the Department of History, Dr. Archie B. Resos. Dr. Resos.
How are you, Glenn? Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And good morning to all our viewers. It is a pleasure to present to you the 12th webinar of the UST Department of History. This Thursday, February 3, 2022, the University of Santo Tomas and the City Government of Manila will be commemorating the 77th year of the liberation of Santo Tomas internment camp. The devastation brought by World War II was immense, and without proper preparation and training under the Commonwealth, the political, economic, and military impact would have been further catastrophic. The Commonwealth era, which is the period of Philippine history prior to World War II, is considered one of the least explored areas in Philippine history. Much has been written and studied about Spanish colonization, American period, Japanese occupation, and the post-war Philippines. While little is written within the period of the Commonwealth, the transition period of American rule to the Philippine independence. Manuel Luis Quezon was one of the Filipino leaders who fought against American rule. As an officer in President Emilio Aguinaldo's military contingent, and as a leading political figure in the American-sponsored government in the Philippines. He held various positions in governance, IDEST, Majority Floor Leader in the Philippine Assembly of 1907, Senate President in 1916, after which he was catapulted as the first president of the Commonwealth period. Quezon moved with swift action during his incumbency as president to foster national unity and peace essential to preserve Philippine independence, create a strong national defense body in order to counter possible foreign aggression, and supposedly to establish economically self-sufficient Philippines in the future. However, such reforms were stymied by American intervention in the diversification of Filipino products as well as the anchoring of the Philippines to an agricultural economy bereft of possible industrialization. Furthermore, the gradual imposition of tariffs and duties on Philippine crops such as sugar, abaca, and tobacco further hampered Philippine economic independence. It is in this context that our speaker, a former alumnus of the UST BA History, Mr. Zuriel Domingo, will present the inception of the Philippine Commonwealth's economic dependence. Zuriel will expound on his scholarly topic titled Quezon's Commonwealth, Overture to Economic Dependence. As my former student and undergraduate thesis mentee, Zuriel will provide us with the proper contextualization of the economic dependence of the Philippines during the administration of President Manuel Quezon. I think it is now timely for the alumni of the BA History program to partake in these activities of sharing their works and initiatives as a contribution to the scholarly knowledge and new insights in the field of Philippine history. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Mabuhay po tayong mga guro at mag-aaral ng kasaysayan. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Dr. Resos, for your excellent remarks. Today, we are fortunate to have a resource speaker that will discuss the important details of his study entitled Quezon's Commonwealth, Overture to Economic Dependence. Let me introduce to you our resource speaker for this morning. Our guest speaker is a lecturer of history at the University of the Philippines-Baguio. He earned his Bachelor's of Arts in History at the University of San Tomas and at the verge of concluding his Master's of Arts in History at the same university. Proactive in research, he is a student affiliate member and an early career researcher network member at the University of Sydney Southeast Asia Center and the London School of Economics and Political Science, Sui Hawk Southeast Asia Center, respectively. He has presented and written works related to history and nationalism in Southeast Asia, Philippines historiography, and pop culture. At present, he is working on his thesis project offering a detailed historical investigation related to the ratification of the parity rights and the resurgence of post-war nationalism against foreign control of the economy in the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker for this morning, please welcome Mr. Luis Zuriel P. Domingo.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Let me first share my PowerPoint presentation before we begin the formal lecture. And I would also like to thank, of course, Dr. Resos for providing the context for today's lecture. And I'm more than grateful to be a part of the webinar series of the University of Santo Tomas Department of History under the helm of Associate Professor RGB Resos. The lineup of speakers of this webinar series range from well-known historians to seasoned faculty members from top university in the Philippines. So it is indeed a privilege to be invited and given the opportunity of my home department as an undergraduate and now as a graduate student in España, Manila to join you today. And of course, thank you also to the organizing committee, to Glenn and to Assistant Professor Dr. Jeric Albela. My lecture this morning focuses on Manuel L. Quezon, the first president of the Commonwealth, and his maneuvering of the country's path towards economic independence. This topic is a condensed version of a preliminary chapter that I produced for my master's thesis. More to its premise of economic history, in my study, I also incorporated a historical examination of Quezon's intellectual history in this particular period. His autocratic leadership, duly supported by the Filipino elite, that affected the preparedness of the Philippines for economic independence. I would like to recognize the various literature that helped me in shaping my assertions and providing the spot on context in understanding Quezon and its intellectual history. The works of Sol Gueco, Carlos Quirino, Theodore Friend, Aruna Gopinath, Alfred McCoy, Michael Honorato, and most recently, Veronica Alporja. In my investigation, however, I discovered that it is essential to discuss Quezon's political role in maintaining state power and influence over the Filipino elite through kleptocratic politics in relation to his conduct of Philippine politics, and how this led to such negligence of the worsening social problems and wasted opportunity for economic independence. But I will only focus on the overview of his economic maneuvering. In essence, the Commonwealth period under Quezon served as a backgrounder to the subsequent post-colonial politics under a modern Principalia class and to a palpable economic reliance on foreign control of the economy, which is evident up to the present day of conduct Philippine national and local politics. Joy, anticipation, excitement, above all triumph, were the Filipinos' prevailing emotions when it witnessed the splendor and vanity of the country's first Commonwealth investiture at the steps of the Legislative Building in Manila on 15 November 1935. At 57 years old, it was Manuel L. Quezon's most anticipated day of attainment, carrying all confidence and pride he could muster from his early days of public office in Tayabas to the splendor neoclassical facade of the legislative building, as he is about to deliver his inaugural speech as elected president of the Philippine Commonwealth. He began with an expression of gratitude and appreciation to the Filipino people and, of course, to the American delegation present in this momentous occasion. Quote, "It is my hope that the ties of friendship and affection which bind the Philippines to America will remain unbroken and grow stronger after the severance of our political relations with her." Unquote. Throwing words of encouragement of what must be done, he ended his speech reinforcing the Filipino people's path to independence. As it was, quote, "an enormous task of fully preparing ourselves for independence. We shall be beset with serious difficulties, but we will resolutely march forward. I appeal to your patriotism and summon your nobility of heart so that we may, united in common endeavor, once more dedicate ourselves to the realization of our national destiny." Unquote. This was Quezon's defining moment, an entire political career devoted to mastering statecraft, unconventionally built on autocracy, had been finally realized. But the palpability that begets this period of independent nationhood was Quezon as its Commonwealth preparation for the country's actualization of a viable economy in relation to the role of the United States in this given period of transition. Echoing Leon Bauer, quote, "The principal problem which must be solved by the new government will be economic, and the future, success or failure, of the Commonwealth will be determined very largely by this factor." Unquote. 3 decades before this historic event, the United States found itself in possession of unprecedented power in an era of new imperialism and global politics, so unrelenting that the annexation of the Philippines was adequately effortless, and its ethos of disguised humanizing missions left the islands open to malevolent exploits and pillage. The Filipino elite, composed of the Principalia and the Chinese mestizos, who had their hopes on Aguinaldo and his band of revolutionaries, gave up and abandoned their aspirations in all selfishness, without a choice but to adhere to the gifts of suppressed freedom and servitude under American rule, in order to protect their well-being, while the masses, whose efforts of the short-lived revolution must be credited on, watched in dismay how the Filipino elite subserviently offered their service to the American colonialism. But after 2 decades of American colonial democracy, the Philippines was in a period of unprecedented growth and learning. The provincial elite, the growing middle class, the now educated masses started to show signs of self determination, and the Philippines was ready to take on the road without training wheels. Meanwhile, the gentlemen of the period, a new batch of Filipino ilustrados, led a crusade on the question of independence. The timing was perfect. The United States found itself in a period of tumult. After their annexation of the Philippines, the United States was the wealthiest nation amongst its contemporary empires, and their late participation in the First World War made them a world power alongside Great Britain and the Soviet state. The next decade, however, followed significant disruptions in politics and the economy. The American heartland was plagued with domestic problems like labor unrest and prohibition. Externally, threats like Japan made Washington paranoid of a possible war in the Pacific. So when the Philippine independence missions began, the Filipinos always had the advantage in their plea. Quezon successfully brought home the Tidings McDuffie Act of 1934. The Filipino people experienced a taste of promised independence for the first time, but in a period of transition of 10 years. Quezon was in ecstasy. His acquisition of the Tidings McDuffie Act pressured the Philippine legislature to hastily mobilize a constitutional convention that will draft a new constitution. However, the Philippine legislature requested congressional visits for the final modification of provisions to which the US Senate agreed and all expenses paid. Primarily, the visits, while the convention was still in session, imprecisely affected the framing and adoption of the 1935 Philippine Constitution that set Filipino actualization of power, but in favor and on the boundaries of American foreign control of the economy. In light of this view, Senator Kenneth McKellar, a Democrat who had voted for Philippine independence bills and part of the said congressional visit, reported that while Filipinos wanted independence, he saw a possibility of an economic collapse unless they were accorded indefinitely duty-free trade privileges with the United States. Galling remarks for some members of the Philippine legislature who rallied behind the proposition of absolute independence. Senator McKellar only spoke candor. Eventually, the United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the newly minted Philippine Constitution in Washington, D.C. on 25 March 1935. The following election was held in favor of the Quezon-Osmeña political tandem. Quezon, now president of the Commonwealth, received an overwhelming amount of political influence and power on his hands. The duly orchestrated the country's overture under colonial tutelage, and because of an entrenched colonial democracy, it transformed the image of the colonizer from conqueror to benefactor. After Quezon enacted the Commonwealth Act Number 1 on national defense, he prepared the national economy through the Commonwealth Act Number 2, creating the National Economic Council with the duty to quote, to formulate an economic program based on national independence, unquote. Speaking in front of the National Assembly on 18 December, less than a week before the official signing, Quezon argued that the creation of such council is to bring about a gradual, systematic, and sound adjustment and reconstruction of our national economy so as to adapt to our already modified conditions and to those that will obtain when we shall have a complete sovereign state. Quezon was right in this regard. While economic independence is equivalent to political autonomy, a planned economy is the first step toward total emancipation from dependency. He recognized the economic problem of the country as, quote, in a sense more urgent because they affect directly the lives of the people, likewise deserve immediate attention, unquote. Quezon added further, quote, I come from the masses. My ancestors were of the poor class. I am not afraid nor ashamed to confess that my heart beats in unison with the hearts of the needy and for them. Justice shall be done to the poor and the humble in this country, so long as I am president, unquote. This stemmed from getting the support of the masses despite Quezon's obvious middle class background. However, all these socialist remarks of recognizing the working class and their importance in Filipino society through their amelioration upon a planned economy will only reflect on the idea of his social justice program in 1938. Quezon was a profuse political speaker. His words about a planned economy built on national independence and social justice were vague. Therefore, the aspired economy for Filipinos without American dependency remained an open question. Despite acceptable economic and financial performance of the Philippines from 1935 to 1938, Paul V. McNaught, U.S. Commissioner, suggested that both parties should set in motion a realistic re-examination of long-term interests, eager to solidify the United States' influence in Philippine Islands. He was pointing out a policy, quote, favoring a permanent political and economic relationship, unquote, with hopes that the enduring welfare and safety of both countries should be paramount consideration, unquote. In Quezon's point of view, MacNaught's suggestion about economic relations was unsaleable, but should the Philippine question be re-examined, he would remain firm to his commitment of this agreement on continued American control of foreign affairs, public debt, currency, tariff, and immigration. In light of the ongoing issue, reactionaries who were against the idea of Philippine independence continued a demand of re-examination of American commitment to the Philippines, and MacNaught was dubbed by the Filipino public opinion as the most protruding re-examinationist. With Quezon's neglectful attitude, some American officials who shared the responsibility and hopeful in his conduct of Philippine affairs were dismayed, and in discomfort, they had nothing but, quote, watch the erosion of democratic institutions and processes, the neglect of festering social problems, and the waste of opportunities to prepare the Philippine Republic for meaningful economic independence, unquote. The Tidings-McDuffie Act prepared the Philippines politically, according to the American concept of responsibilities related to self-government, freedom, and independence. Still, economically, the United States deprived the Filipinos of their international personality. The imposition of full American quotas and tariffs on exports only tied the Filipino market with the American market. Under the same law, the Philippines may not forge economic or commercial agreements with other foreign powers without the guidance and approval of the President of the United States. Despite the autonomy that the Commonwealth government brought to Filipinos, it should be taken into account that the United States granted a preparatory stage, not independent statehood. To understand the American attitude of why Washington wanted to dictate the direction of Philippine politics and economy, Catherine Porter, who regularly writes for the Far Eastern Survey about American affairs in the Philippines, explained that the United States was, quote, not only of safeguarding the Philippines, not but of providing some assurance of the existence of the country as an independent state after 1946, unquote. In other words, from the American perspective, it is always defense and moral duty. Porter even cited that foreign trade of the country only expanded under American rule and that free trade has been greatly in favor of the Philippines than the United States. She also added that American investments are of vital importance to the Philippine economy. In 1935, major American investors continued pouring their money in sugar, coconut, and abaca industries, competing with Filipino investment and capital. In 1938, the Americans still controlled 44% of public services, ranging from transportations, communications, water, and gas. Therefore, Filipino capital is still in competition, but also at a disadvantage against its American counterpart. Despite Quezon's action of programs to transfer the Filipino control of economy, as he promised in the early days of the induction of his Commonwealth Act No. 2, the country was still dependent on the United States. but also because the Americans continue to enjoy such privileges through the Tidings-McDuffie Act. Washington ensured that the American interests needed to be secured at their end in granting the Filipinos their independence. Apart from the above considerations, the idea of industrialization remained controversial for the Commonwealth government. This is the mistake of Quezon and the Commonwealth, and their idea of a planned economy to the National Economic Council. Quezon's objective was, quote, to build up a reasonably stable economic structure capable of serving the financial and the other needs of the nation, supplying the masses of the people with basic social requirements and the essentials in food, clothing, shelter, and providing them with opportunities to toil and earn a decent living, unquote. But Quezon has not declared an attempt to drive the economy towards the idea of industrialization. Porter concurred to Quezon's idea, but counseled that to attain this objective, the following problems must be dealt with any coordinated attempt to plan a new national economy: landholding and tenancy, crop control, which have depended largely on the American market. Allied to this, of course, is the need to encourage the initiation and intensification of other agricultural projects to fully domestic needs, and it's possible to provide other export commodities. Industrialization to furnish employment, to supply domestic markets with raw materials, to aid the country in attaining some degree of self-sufficiency in manufactured goods, and to provide new goods to sell in foreign markets. Aruna Gopinath, however, differed in his interpretation of Quezon's declaration. According to Gopinath, the campaign for economic self-sufficiency is placed on the patronization of local products and business enterprises. Awakening the Filipinos' necessity of utilizing their products can only assure the takeoff of domestic manufacturing. Quezon's idea of economic nationalism therefore is built on protection. Protectionism not measured on protective tariffs, differential transportation charges, bounties on export, ship subsidies, discouragement of foreign enterprises, and the nationalization of capital and import quotas. Rather, protectionism within limits, an increased vocational efficiency of the people. Quezon and his Commonwealth instead promoted the idea of state-owned enterprises, what we can call SOEs, in order to carry on the limitations of industrialization and promote economic adjustment. From four SOEs in 1935, by 1940, 14 businesses were created under the supervision of the government, ranging from railroad, cement, textile, canning companies, among others. Though commendable, the Filipino capitalists at that time did not have sufficient capital to compete with their American counterparts. But it does not mean that Quezon's action about the establishment of SOEs and their failure only to provide band-aid solutions to the industrialization were unsound, as these were transpired because of Quezon, and his technocrats were left with no other choice nor alternatives to a more efficient economic adjustment that will not rely on dependency. Generally, this transition period under the Commonwealth equipped the growing nationalist sentiment that, quote, no amount of miseducation and misinformation can conceal the objective reality of economic exploitation. That is the fundamental motive for colonization, unquote. By 1945, data showed American investments in the islands are estimated to be around 258,564 million dollars. Capital that flowed into the islands through the exploitation of coconut, sugar, gold, hemp, and tobacco. These figures were enough reasons for the American capitalists and Washington to continue business in the Philippines after the war. Claro M. Recto, an important political actor of the pre-war and post-war history of the Philippines, and my main protagonist in my master's thesis alongside Jose P. Laurel and Lorenzo Tañada, once criticized Quezon's mismanagement of the Commonwealth and dependency with the Americans, as he warned Filipinos. A dip into the future would make us realize with the pang of premonition the grave and deplorable consequences resulting from such acts to our national honor, sovereignty, and control of such sources of wealth, and our territorial integrity. Unquote. Historian Antonio M. Molina argued that the condition of the national economy during the Commonwealth to be steady and assuring. However, his idea of constant and promising is a national economy dependent on the United States. Quezon and other Philippine leaders indeed patronized the idea of a economic nationalism. The establishment of the National Economic Council under the Commonwealth Act Number 2, the promotion of local products, establishment of the SOEs, and his social justice program. But there were many barriers to the national economy for adjustments and independence. The Tidings McDuffie Act was the most significant hindrance to this adjustment and self attainment of economic freedom. The transition years, abiding accordingly to free trade provisions, inevitably delivered dependence and underdevelopment. In conclusion, the United States did not prepare the Philippines for the process of economic adjustment and independence during the Commonwealth period. Economic power toward commerce and trade is achievable only with the idea of political independence. The same way that political independence is valid with such existence of economic independence. Forward looking, after the events of the Commonwealth, the misgivings of the said government will have their effect in the post war period. Double cross, the Philippines will be put under the spell of neocolonialism and dependency, and Quezon's politicking and quite debatable mismanagement of the Commonwealth made it hard to attain fundamental goal of economic independence, making the Philippines dependent on the United States in terms of managing its economic and financial future. Thank you very much.
Okay, so at this point, we will now proceed to the Q&A session. Please use the comment section for those who are watching through our FB page and the live chat section for the participants in YouTube. Please state your institution to be followed by your question and comments. But first, Mr. Domingo, I have a comment here coming from one of our esteemed uh, organizers. For
All right.
okay. Okay, so okay, wag na daw. Okay, but nevertheless, let's proceed uh to our questions. Okay, from our FB and YouTube comments. Okay, sige. Sige, while he is selecting sige. In accordance for the question of one of our organizers, for the presentation that you just discussed, how is this connected to social justice program of Quezon?
All right. It's actually an interesting question by Professor Albella about the connection of the social justice program with the idea of economic independence and economic dependence during the Commonwealth. It is actually the way I interpret it. It's the last resort of Quezon to uplift the needs of the masses. If you see during the National Economic Council, um, the real goal talaga is to provide the needs of the masses. Because ganun naman talaga when you're planning the national economy. Your first priority is yung may kailangan. At the same time, dapat nag-harmonize yung industrialization. At the same time, yung pag-control ng economy. Now, it was in 1935, napabayaan ng National Economic Council yung plans nila for the social justice program. Actually, it was planned around 1935 to 1936 and was only implemented in 1938. Hindi ko na siya na-include with my presentation. But I have this long paragraph in this particular chapter wherein I discuss how the National Economic Council performed. You see, it was well organized in 1936. However, mabagal yung trabaho na nagagawa nila. Apart from that kasi, may mga other works din naman yung mga members ng council. And it's composed of early day public officials, yung mga early day technocrats natin in the Philippines, educated by the Americans. And you will see, late lang nila na-realize to have this kind of programs in 1938. And around 1938, if we go back to our history, nagkakaroon na ng mga re-examination, question of re-examination. So dapat ba talagang bigyan ng independence ang Pilipinas? Is the Philippines capable of being independent? Enough ba yung transition years ng 10 years? So the social justice program, in my opinion, in my perhaps investigation in this particular period, should have been the first program of Quezon by 1935. What kickstarted the social justice program, what pushed the National Economic Council and Quezon is yung mga issue na ng sakdal, then sa provinces you have so many insurgencies na you have the peasants, demanding these rights. So yun yung nag-push na sa kanila to have the social justice program in 1938. And yung implementation pa by 1938 is hindi maayos because you don't have a stable economy by 1938. You are still dependent and reliant on the United States. So, but this is also a good topic to explore on. Medyo onti lang yung discussion ko sa kanya in my chapter. And this is perhaps a good topic to explore on to some of our viewers and listeners who wants to do research, perhaps after the pandemic. Mahabang-habang research to in this particular topic.
Okay. So far, we still have we're still looking for some questions. Okay, for here, if I'm going to add into my question na lang muna,
Right.
How did Quezon's economic program po progress after the war po?
It was a total back to zero. You see, the war basically sobrang lugmok ng country natin that we have to, beg for money to the United States to help the rebuilding of the economy post-war period. And we started again with zero everything. And if kung meron man economic program si Quezon, perhaps wala akong maisip. But ito yung nakakalungkot. By 1946, we still adopted the American policies. And mas na-bend pa, actually. We were given political independence, but based on our sources, on our studies, and based on my study in my thesis, wala tayong economic independence by 1946. And I still expounded that on my succeeding chapters after this. That's why I titled this lecture and my chapter as Overture to Economic Dependence. It all started our reliance and dependency with the United States during the Commonwealth period. And this will continue in 1946, in 1947. Lalong-lalo na with the parity rights, the Bell Trade Act. And our economy talagang tied siya with the United States after the war. So we were given political independence, but no economic independence. And to achieve political independence, of course, you need economic independence.
Thank you for that answer. So here's another follow-up po from Dr. Albella. Do you
Hmm?
believe that Quezon carefully engineered his political success, and because of this, he was able to expect the weight of economic problems of the Philippines at that time?
Um, Very interesting question about Quezon's intellectual history and as a politician, basically. You see, if you read Quezon, particularly in relation to the works of Alfred McCoy, Quezon, the period of the Commonwealth was considered as the beginnings of Filipino, say, populism and authoritarianism. And Quezon really centralized state power sa kanya. And apart from managing the country, he was also busy then with, crushing his enemies. Lalong-lalo na, we only have the Nationalista back then. And any form of opposition was duly crushed by Quezon. He also used the Philippine Constabulary in particular in controlling his enemies during this particular period. And I think hindi talaga niya in-expect din. I think everyone will agree with me na hindi in-expect ni Quezon yung bigat ng economic problems natin during that time. Because since the colonization of the United States to the Philippines, talagang naging reliant tayo. You see, hindi rin pwede ihiwalay yung idea of colonialism with the American period and the Commonwealth period. We are a colony. Eh. So basically, the Americans were using our natural resources. Ang importante with the colonizers, kaya nga sabi din ni Renato Constantino, this is the shift from the colonizer to benefactor. So kahit may political independence na tayo during the Commonwealth period, hanggat makikinabang si America with our natural resources, talagang e-exploit niya yan. And the United States was also in competition locally with the early day Chinese and Japanese businesses. So, maliban kay Filipino na nahihirapan na mag-control ng sarili niyang economy, sobrang daming barriers pa. Pero in my lecture, I only discussed the tidings McDuffie. Sobrang dami pang barriers in our, say, control of the economy. Kaya talaga hindi na-achieve yung economic independence during the Commonwealth period. And the Americans used this, dumagdag pa yung gera noong 1940s, to impose this many economic control to our economy by 1946 and in 1947. And this will be ito yung laging sinisigaw nila Recto, nila Laurel, nila Tanyada by the post-war period, that the Philippines remained under the control of American, say, foreign control of the economy. And minsan nga, may mga political control pa na very controversial to discuss, but also connected to American control of the economy.
Okay, so here's another follow-up question po. How did the subversive organizations affected the economic plans of Quezon during the Commonwealth period?
Very interesting question. You see, si Quezon, isa to sa malaking problema niya. Yung mga subversive organizations during this particular period. Because you see, ang sinisigaw ng mga organizations na to is absolute independence. Kumbaga, kailangan, o at least totally wala na sa United States. Wala na tayong ties with the United States. And ang sinisisi nila ng mga organizations na ito is yung Tidings McDuffie Act. And yung sabihin na natin pakikipagtango ng ating Filipino elite during this time with the Americans because sila nga yung may interest eh. And mostly these organizations were influenced also by, you see, the spirit of the revolution eh. Medyo fresh pa siya eh. Around 40 to 50 years pa rin siya. And ano bang demand ng ating mga revolutionaries? It's complete independence. Walang form of colonizer. Kaya naiinis sila kay Quezon at sa mga politicians back then. Kasi nakikipag, say, agreement pa with the Americans. And by 1938, you will see Quezon. By 1940s, you will see Rojas, who who had this, say, radio program. Sinasabi niya na better pa ata na nasa United States tayo after the transition period, that we strengthen our relationship with the United States. And etong mga organizations na to, kaya rin sila nanggugulo. We have to understand, maliban sa Sakdal movement, you also have the PKP during that time. And of course, may mga sarili ding ideological, say, na pinupush tong mga organizations na ito, na of course, sa tingin nila na mas makabuti for the Filipinos and also mas makabuti for their organizations.
Okay, so it appears we already have a question from our YouTube channel, YouTube page. How did the series of American economic policies, Philippine Tariff Act, Payne Aldrich, Underwood Simons Act, and the Chinese McDuffie Act shape the economic independence of the Commonwealth?
If you check all these policies, sa tingin natin, it's all, pag ini-interpret natin siya, tingin natin laging win-win situation siya for both the Philippines and the Americans back then. Pero, lalo-lalo na yung tidings sa McDuffie, pag tinignan natin siya, masyado tayong nag-focus dun sa political independence na ipoprovide niya. Pero pag tinignan natin yung tidings sa McDuffie, wala siyang provisions na nagsasabi that it will prepare the Philippines for economic independence. You see, it even tied the Philippines in this transition of 10 years. Nasa kanila pa rin yung monopoly. Lahat ng crops natin, lahat ng resources natin, ibibigay pa rin natin sa United States. Sila pa rin ang priority trade natin. And pagdating pa nung end ng 10 years, pwede pang mag-go into negotiation ang Pilipinas with the United States. And as I mentioned in my lecture, all these economic policies did not give the Philippines its international personality. You see, during that time, in this particular period, ito yung time na so many countries are industrialized already. You have Japan, you have the many countries in Europe, pero ang economy natin still tied with the United States. And because of these economic policies, the tidings McDuffie in particular, we have no choice. Hindi tayo pwede mag-forge ng economic policies with strong economic policies with other nations. Mas naging flexible sana yung economy natin. With, say, Japan, you also have the United Kingdom at that time, and these many rich nations. Ang problema kasi is we are still a colony by the United States. Kahit ba Commonwealth na tayo during that particular period, we already have a president. Majority of the decisions of Quezon, binibase pa rin niya with the United States.
Thank you for that question. Here's a question from one of our faculty members, Tristan Osteria. Okay. Quezon, of course, was even a personal friend of MacArthur and of Eisenhower. To what extent does Quezon draw his vision from the US politicians during the transition?
I think may sarili pa ring pag-iisip yung mga politicians natin back then. Although, kasi majority of them, if we study the intellectual history of this particular period, halos lahat sa kanila is still educated in the Philippines. Majority of them are Tomasians, di ba? Majority of the representatives and those shaping our country back then, during this particular period, were educated under Spain. And fresh pa sa memory nila yung Philippine Revolution. siguro, um, may influence perhaps the Americans, particularly si MacArthur. Pero economic-wise, I cannot see anything. So, I cannot provide any concrete answer kung meron man naging influence si if we will stick with my lecture. Um, wala akong nakita if MacArthur or any of the presidents influenced Quezon with his decisions. Um, Majority of Quezon's decisions was sa kanya, and siguro nagde-depend lang siya with the United States Congress kung okay ba sa kanila. Kasi nga, all our decisions happening here in the country is still dependent on the United States in their particular period.
Okay. So here's another question po. How did the Chinese immigrants, how did the Chinese immigration in the country rather became a hindrance in the economic programs of Quezon? If they were, in what ways?
Not only the Chinese immigrants, but also the Japanese, the two of them. And in fact, kinontrol ni Quezon ito mga to through the anti-dummy accounts. Because the Chinese back then and the Japanese first, the Japanese in Mindanao, for example, they were marrying locals. So para mapasok nila yung capital, yung pera nila dito, pinapakasalan nila yung mga IPs natin in Mindanao. And napakadami kasing lupa sa Mindanao eh. Particularly, baka talagang sa kanila, sila ang may hawak noon. The Chinese naman, they have these dummy businesses. So may mga Filipino partners sila. Majority of these Filipino partners were already Filipino-Chinese. So matagal na silang nandito sa Pilipinas since the Spanish period na nakapag-establish na ng business. And of course, sila yung mas may connection with the national government. So para mas mapasok yung capital ng mga Chinese immigrants natin, ng mga pure Chinese natin from the mainland, they have these dummy accounts. So it was not only the Americans. Magandang clarification yun. Hindi lang Americans yung naging problema to achieve economic independence. It was also the Chinese and the Japanese. Pero these are only local issues eh. Compared to the Americans pa rin, mas grabe yung control nila. Imagine, 44% pa rin ng major industry sa Pilipinas. Nung nangyari yung war, hawak pa rin ng mga Americans. And naging problema nga siya after the war. O sobrang daming American businesses na nandito pa rin. And isa yun sa mga reason na ibinigay ko bakit pinush talaga yung Belt Trade Act at saka yung parity rights. Because ano namang nangyayari sa mga American capitalists na ito? Hindi naman pwedeng biglang sipain na lang sila paalis ng Pilipinas after the war. So, inargue na the parity rights will benefit our rehabilitation. At the same time, it will provide Filipinos. Pero you see, in my further discussions during the time of the parity rights, makikita natin na walang capital formation, there was no technological transfer. So, what is happening during the Commonwealth period, our problem with the Americans, which is only a win situation for them, it's also a win situation for them also during the post-war period. And I think very aware si Glenn dito with this particular topic, hindi ganun magiging problem ang Chinese during the post-war period. Medyo matatahimik sila. Papasok na lang ulit sila with the issue of the Filipino First policy. So mawawala sila for a short time. And dyan ulit papasok yung issue ng Filipino First policy. The Japanese, after the war, of course, we know what happened to them. But they will remain in Davao and Baguio. So many businesses will remain in Davao and Baguio. Pero eventually, mawawala din sila. They will go back to Japan after the war.
Follow-up in my question po, sir. Did the quota in immigration during the Commonwealth era help?
We only followed the Immigration Acts of the United States. Kasi ito yung naging problem ng US around this particular period. Dumadami yung mga Chinese doon. Dumadami yung mga Japanese. Dumadami yung mga yellow race, yung mga Asians sa American heartland. even mga Koreans during this particular period, mga pre-war Koreans. And si Pilipinas, sumunod lang din siya with the United States. So, kinontrol yung pagdami kasi pasok lang sila ng pasok dito Kumbaga, hindi rin tayo prepared. You see, global history-wise, this is really a period of wala talagang borders. Everyone can travel. Everyone can go to different countries and establish their businesses to, magkaroon ng bagong buhay in a new land. And isa yon sa mga naging problema ni Quezon na hindi niya na-imagine by 1940s. Sobrang dami na. By 1938, particularly that year, sobrang dami ng immigrants na nandito. The Japanese and the Chinese. Nakatulong ba yung pag-control sa kanila? I don't have any data. I cannot provide any data to answer this question. But I will take note of this question. Let's see if ma-add natin pa to sa particular chapter natin. That's why I'm very thankful for these questions that will still help me in improving this particular chapter.
Thank you for that. Here's another question from our YouTube channel. From Al Mukhtar Musa. You have stated that the Philippines was very much dependent to the US during the Commonwealth era. Did the Philippines somehow experience economic progress or development?
From our perspective, there is indeed underdevelopment. Wala talagang economic progress. From the perspective of the Americans, they think that Filipino capital is already also is not capable of handling kaya nga ayaw nila i-give up yung mga businesses nila. Ang wrong move talaga ng mga early leaders natin back then is natay tayo with the Tidings-McDuffie Act, wherein there's no provision na tutulungan tayo with economic independence. At the same time, wala ring provisions that says na we can control the Americans here in the country. Kasi malaya silang nakakapagpaikot ng capital ng pera nila dito Compared to the Filipino capital, imagine state-owned enterprises by 1935 were only 4. State-owned enterprises were only 4. By 1940s, there were around 15 to 18, I believe, before the war. So, mabagal din yung pagtatayo ng mga state-owned enterprises. Kasi nga, again, we will go back to the issue of the Spanish businesses, the Chinese and the Japanese, kakompetensya ng mga Filipino to, pagdating pa maliban sa American, sila yung kakompetensya pa. Ang hina ng Filipino capital during that time because we don't have control of the economy. So, based on my study, I think there's no economic progress in this period. But, of course, this is still debatable and open to many questions. But in my study, of course, there was no economic progress. We're still dependent. That's why in my next chapter, I discuss na it was easy for the Americans and for the Filipinos to accept all these economic ties with the Americans during the post-war period.
Okay. As a follow-up to the Japanese immigration answer kanina po, was the Japanese immigration increase in number during the 30s, which it was become the first time that it's overpassed the Chinese immigrants here in our country. Did it become helpful or it became a threat to the Philippine economy? Did Quezon already have an idea that Japanese soon would invade the Philippines in the next coming years?
Okay, this is actually my final paper to Professor Resos during my subject sa American period about the Japanese immigrants in the country. Because you will see in the 1930s, grabe talaga yung dagsa nila. And so many factors to consider. Bakit mabilis at madami yung pagdagsa nila sa Pilipinas? Unang-una, sa Japan mismo, ine-encourage yung pagpunta sa Pilipinas and to Southeast Asia in general because of the idea of Pan-Asianism. You see, the journalists and the politicians, yung mga statesmen nila in Japan, were encouraging na kailangan nilang pumunta ng Southeast Asia. There were new opportunities. Another factor is some Japanese in the provinces, particularly sa mga provinces nila in Japan, were looking for a better life. Naghahanap sila ng, like the Chinese din, naghahanap sila ng kung saan sila mas mamumuhay ng mas maayos. Kasi nga, may mga problema naman din yung Japan during this particular period. You will see na ang daming pinasukan ni Japan na gera at the turn of the century. So, some Japanese don't like this kind of situation in their country. So, kaya sila pumunta rin ng Pilipinas. Now, they did help our economy. Because of so many dummies and yung style nga nila na nag-aasawa sila ng mga indigenous people natin to put their capital in the country, naging threat to kay Quezon and to the Commonwealth period. Kaya nga nagkaroon ng big interest ang Commonwealth period sa mga Japanese immigrants in this particular period. But I found out na the Japanese in particular were very helpful in Mindanao. You see, they helped Mindanao, Davao in particular, na lumago. Kasi hindi lang naman threat sila sa economy natin. May mga naitutulong din sila because dumadami yung immigrants dito. They were establishing schools, they were establishing these clubs, these economic organizations, they were, building homes dito. So, in terms of immigration, it's a problem. In terms of the economy, I think it's a threat to Quezon. But in terms of helping Mindanao and the Davao region in particular, it was a big A plus for the Commonwealth government. Because alam naman natin napakalaking issue nung nakakalimutan lagi nung capital city yung Mindanao. Kasi siya yung pinakamalayo sa peripheries. Laging ang development na lang, laging nabubuhos yung pera sa Luzon and to some parts of Visayas because you have leaders there. And we all know naman in the Commonwealth period na ang Mindanao during this time is an early acquisition of the Philippines. It was only through the help of the Americans that we acquired Mindanao. And yung development doon, hindi pa alam hindi alam paano i-handle ng Commonwealth. So it was a good move for the Japanese to establish their businesses there that helped the development of Davao region.
Okay, so here's our last question from our YouTube. Okay, from Benedict Eugene Abiera. Is there any moves made by the Filipino capitalists to pressure or even push the Quezon's administration to revise his economic policy during the Commonwealth era?
There were so many attempts. Of course, alam naman natin ang Filipino elite, sila lang talagang capable. Sila lang yung may pera during that time. And when we say Filipino capitalists, majority of these Filipino capitalists already have their businesses during the Spanish period pa. And if we go back to our history during the Spanish period, alam naman natin na nag-open tayo with the global trade during the 19th century. And in opening the global trade, ito din nagkaroon ng rise ng middle class. But also, it also gave rise to the elite class. Dito na-establish sa mga businesses nila. And pagdating ng revolution, magiging mahabang topic to, particularly dun sa haves and have-nots na idea. And pagdating ng American period, sila majority yung nag-support sa pag-take over ng Americans to our country. Because una, it will protect their businesses, the Filipino capitalists. Second, they also supported Quezon and the Tidings McDuffie. Una nga ng hair hose cutting full support din sila. Pero pagdating ng Tidings McDuffie, full support din sila. Because of course, with political independence, they thought na mas lalakas yung control nila to the economy. Pero hindi nila in-expect na grabing kompetensya pa rin yung meron sila with the Americans by 1935. So, not that they pressured Quezon to sabihin nating tulungan sila para umayos yung mga businesses nila or mas lumawak pa yung mga business nila. But they supported Quezon rather. They did not pressure Quezon na okay, ganito yung mga gawin mo policies para panigan tayo. They supported always yung mga businesses. They supported the policies rather for their businesses. But laking problema pa rin sa kanila is yung American counterparts nga. Sobrang hirap makipagkompetensya. With the Chinese and the Japanese, yes, kayang talunin ng Filipino capital sila And makikita naman natin na selected areas lang kung nasaan yung mga Chinese at yung mga Japanese compared to the Filipinos, that majority of major towns and cities in the Visayas. In Metro Manila, for example, during that time, in Mega Manila, you have an expanding Manila back then. Still the Filipino capitalists are in control. Pressured Quezon? I don't think so. But they supported, of course, the Commonwealth period.
Okay, thank you for those answers. Okay, at this moment, we would like to apologize to you, our participants, as we do not have the luxury of time to proceed. Thus, we cannot further accommodate any more questions. Rest assured, your questions, if there's any further questions, will be forwarded to Mr. Domingo. Once again, thank you very much. And to present the certificate of appreciation, let me call on again the chairperson of the UST Department of History, Dr. Archie Rezos.
First and foremost, I would like to thank you, Zuriel, who was my student before. And this is a well-rounded presentation about Philippine independence during the time of Manuel L. Quezon, the Americans, and this might be able to contribute a lot in finishing your thesis, because we really need people in order to infuse younger and dynamic blood in the department. And I'm looking forward for you to finish and write your master's thesis. And for the presentation, of course, of our certificate, do you have that? Ayan. Okay, so thank you so much, Glenn. The Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas, Faculty of Arts and Letters, the Department of History, would like to award the Certificate of Appreciation to Mr. Luis Zuriel P. Domingo, MA candidate, for being the resource speaker in the UST Department of History 12 webinar in discussing his paper titled Quezon's Commonwealth, Overture to Economic Dependence, held online on January 31, that is today, 2022, signed Associate Professor Archie Rezos, PhD, Chairperson of the UST Department of History, and of course, Professor Marilu R. Madruño, PhD, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Letters. Again, Zuriel, thank you so much, and I hope this is not going to be the first and the last presentation that we are going to have for our department. Thank you so much, Zuriel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rezos.
Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Rezos, Mr. Domingo, and to our viewers. For our registered participants to receive an e-certificate of participation for this event, the Secretariat will send the link for evaluation for today's webinar through your respective email. By accomplishing it, the certificate will be awarded to you. To end our program for this morning, please join us in singing the AB hymn and the UST hymn. Muli, magandang araw po sa ating lahat and Happy Chinese New Year.
Carved from the mighty rock of faith, shaped by traditions of old, steered by God's guiding hands towards farther shores of our dreams, faithful vessel on the gentle hand. The seas lucent blue in a distant white. The mind's strong reason in the heart's delight. We are lovers of beauty, tinkers and